everyone, we're going to get started. So if you could please find your seats, that would be great. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shia Cabas, and I direct the Economic Policy Project here at BPC, under which our higher education policy work lives. Today's U.S. higher education system faces an array of challenges. First and foremost, a post-secondary degree feels increasingly out of reach for too many Americans. For example, out-of-pocket costs for tuition, fees, room, and board at four-year public institutions have increased by 70% since the year 2000, and that's after adjusting for inflation. At the same time, household incomes have been relatively stagnant. For millions of students, these factors have made it financially difficult, if not impossible, to access a high-quality post-secondary education. A jarring reflection of this is that food insecurity is an issue for more than 30% of students on some campuses. I think we can all agree that no student should ever have to choose between covering costs associated with continuing their education and affording their next meal. For many of those who do manage to attend, obtaining a higher education is only possible through shouldering significant student debt, which comes with a heavy price. Many of you in this room probably know that 70% of students who receive a bachelor's degree come out with education debt. So we're really talking about a pervasive challenge. A new survey that BPC conducted with Morning Consult that will be released in the coming days finds that half of all borrowers say their debt has taken a toll on their physical or mental well-being. And nearly 2/3 say that it has negatively affected their ability to build up emergency savings. To make matters worse, many post-secondary students don't achieve the return on investment that they anticipated. This can be attributed in part to a lack of accountability in the higher education system. Too many institutions have lackluster graduation rates and poor loan repayment outcomes. In some cases, the credential a student receives has little to no effect on their future earnings potential. With this context, I want to make the case that what we're really here to talk about today is economic opportunity. The opportunity to attend a high-quality institution regardless of your financial means or background. The opportunity to pursue this education without mortgaging your financial future by taking on an overwhelming debt burden. And the opportunity to know that your degree or certificate from the program you attend will be worth much more than the paper that it's written on. An accessible, affordable, and accountable higher education system is one that provides all Americans with the chance to make a financially sound investment in their own future success. I'm very excited to be here today to share with you the final consensus recommendations of BPC's Task Force on Higher Education Financing and Student Outcomes that is co-chaired by former Congressman George Miller and Buck McKeon, both of whom were former chairmen of the House Education and Labor Committee. I'll come back to them in just a moment, but this effort has been nearly 2 years in the making, so there are a few other people we need to thank. I know it's cliche to say that this report wouldn't have happened without so-and-so, but that really is the case for each of these next people that I'm going to name. First, I want to express an enormous amount of gratitude to our 15 other task force members. The co-chairs are going to recognize each of them individually, but it's inspiring to see that these incredibly accomplished and busy people spent hours and hours for 7 full-day meetings here with us at BPC to reach the conclusions that we did today. So thank you all very much. Just as importantly, I want to recognize our higher ed team at BPC that staffed these task force meetings and drafted the report that you have in front of you today. Mariette Aborn is our terrific project associate. If you saw her if you saw her behind the scenes, you would know that she had the planning for today's event down to a science. Janan Batar, who's here in the front row, our senior analyst who's going to moderate the first panel this morning, always astounds me with the wealth of knowledge that she has accumulated and that she brings to the table for more than a decade of working in higher education policy. And then last, but certainly not least, somewhere here is Kenny Megan, who many of you know. He's our associate director and our higher ed lead. It's hard to put into words the blood, sweat, and tears that Kenny has applied to this work over the past 2 years. He's been fantastic to have on the team here at BPC for about 5 years, and he was really the backbone of this effort from day one. So I'd appreciate if you would join me in giving Mariette, Janan, and Kenny a big round of applause. Staying on BPC staff, I need to give a quick shout out to Jordan Lapierre and Ben Brophy on our communications team. Those of you familiar with the think tank world will appreciate the nightmare of putting out a 140-page report and prepping it for publication. And also, this task force is especially unique in the sense that we had to get approval for that document from 17 people outside of our organization, beyond the bureaucracy that obviously exists in every institution. I also want to acknowledge BPC's generous partners that provided us with the financial resources to undertake this effort. You can find them listed inside the cover of the task force reports. Finally, let me come back to our co-chairs. Before I invite them up here to get the program underway, I just need to say that anyone who has worked with either of these two former chairmen knows that they are just fun people to be around. They have known one another for decades, for better or worse. I'll let them tell you which one it is. And that relationship, along with their leadership, is what enabled this group to reach conclusion and offer these consensus recommendations to help advance negotiations around reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. So please join me in recognizing them as they make their way up to the stage.
It's wonderful to learn that you're first. I've been helping him all these years, and he wouldn't take my word that
He calls that help. Sorry, George. Before beginning, I would like to thank each and every one of you for making the effort to be here this morning, and also for what you do in your various roles, helping the people of this nation improve their lives through education. You know, many believe that U.S. higher education, our system is the best in the world. I've had the opportunity to visit many countries. I've seen firsthand the high regard that people overseas have for our institutions and how they send them here to get educated. But despite our prestige on the world stage, we are facing some real challenges here at home. The price of education after high school is becoming less and less affordable to more and more Americans. A poll out just this week showed that less than 1/4 of Americans believe that college is affordable. Too few students complete their education. Those that do finish often do not have the skills that employers need in the workplace. Some borrowers are having a hard time repaying the loans they borrowed despite past efforts to offer more repayment options. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence that the red tape and complexity of the federal financing system may be hurting borrowers rather than helping them. The fact is that many students are not getting a positive return on the investment of their time and our money in higher education. It's against this backdrop that the Bipartisan Policy Council asked George and myself to co-chair a task force on higher education financing and student outcomes. And you see how well we work together. Sorry again. We brought together 17 former lawmakers, college presidents, and higher education leaders from across the political spectrum. Over the course of 18 months, we held 7 full-day meetings and came to consensus around a package of 45 recommendations designed to promote access, affordability, and accountability in the U.S. higher education system. We know that these are highly partisan times, especially when it comes to education. In the last Congress, my friend and former colleague Virginia Fox introduced a great higher education bill that I would have supported, but no Democrats supported it. Her successor, Bobby Scott, great friend, we came to Congress together, the current chairman, introduced a higher education bill in this Congress that I think George would probably support, but no Republicans supported it. The Senate can't pass it, and the president wouldn't sign it. Likewise, the task force was equally philosophically divided, particularly on the key question of what level of federal resources should be directed to post-secondary education. Those on the left felt that more spending was needed to increase access and affordability. Those on the right noted that the federal government was already providing more than $150 billion per year in aid, yet tuition prices continue to rise. This dynamic led us to conclude early on that in order to reach agreement, we would pursue a neutral package that would reallocate the existing budget to better serve students. It's important to note that not every member of our group would support every individual recommendation in this report. For example, there are many proposals in here that I would have preferred to leave out, especially with regard to creating new federal programs. But each of us agreed to advance this as a full package of reforms that was better targeted at some of the challenges that I discussed earlier. So despite the challenges and the difficult environment, we must act to help more Americans obtain the skills needed in today's and tomorrow's economy. Now's the time for all sides to be pragmatic and willing to compromise, just as we did on the task force.
Buck, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. And Buck was a wonderful chair of this task force, and when you see the finished product, you're so excited about it because in this case, it really I think addresses fundamental change that needs to take place, and with the recognition that over several decades, the higher education landscape has experienced profound change. No longer are the average students an 18-year-old coming out of high school and living on campus. Today's student body is increasingly composed of adults, working students, parents, and part-time students. These students require a different set of supports compared to the young adult enrolled in full-time and living on campus. Their report puts, you have to bear with me, I'm struggling with a torn retina here, so I'm fine, I just, I'm trying to tell these words to sit down. This report has a great deal of focus on the cost of complexity and outdated systems that work against the interests of students and families seeking to enroll in the many institutions of higher education. This system and outdated financial requirements, in many cases, erect financial and institutional barriers to successful enrollment and completion. Our nation and our families can no longer afford the current system. Unfortunately, federal higher education policy has not kept pace with these changes. The Higher Education Act, the primary piece of legislation guiding federal involvement in higher education policy, has not been updated since 2008. Right, Buck? Okay. When Buck and I served together in the Education and Labor Committee, we were able to pound it out and to get it done. And I wouldn't say today is less difficult. I think it's more difficult today to do that, unfortunately, with the loss of bipartisanship. But hopefully this report will kindle that again, certainly in the education community. These recommendations include several measures to reduce unmet need among low-income and middle-class students. I'm particularly proud of the proposals for a large increase in Pell Funding and a long overdue establishment of federal-state partnership, which would provide states with an additional incentive to boost higher education investments. The package also curtails ineffective federal spending and identifies reforms to boost efficiencies in the student loan program and put downward pressure on borrowing. In order to strengthen the institutional accountability, we propose a policy that would effectively prohibit the worst performing institutions from accepting taxpayer dollars. We also prescribe a system of incentives that would promote continuous improvement for all institutions of higher education. It is important to note that the flip side of institutional accountability is having the financial capacity and to support students, which is why we favor the federal investments in Title III and V and further build the capacity of minority-serving institutions and other schools that are under-resourced. Finally, our recommendations emphasize the importance of providing high-quality data and information for students to inform them of the decision-making about where they're going to enroll, how they're going to enroll, and how they're going to finance it. I'll close by saying that this package is both comprehensive and data-driven. And most importantly, it signals that a bipartisanship can indeed be possible in the education world, and it's critical that it happen sooner than later, given the 10-year span of where we have not addressed these issues. Even in the era of political polarization, this can all happen. Buck and I had our disagreements over the years. We have them today, and we'll probably have some tomorrow. But we were usually able to put aside those differences and figure out how we could bring our committee together, how we could pass legislation, go to the floor, and upgrade the educational experience of young people and the families. This report highlights problems and highlights workable and equitable solutions. But I need to note that it wouldn't have happened without both Buck's chairmanship of the task force and the members of the task force, who just were amazing task of knowledge and experience and understanding of this system and the evolutions in this system to guide many of the recommendations here. It would have been interesting if you all saw how we were huddled over in different groups at different times, pounding out our differences and allowed this report to come forward. And I just wish you could have seen this huddle that was taking place among people with a huge amount of experience. Different experiences, but a huge amount of experience. It was really a contribution to this effort, and I don't think we could have done it with a different group. For those of us, who aren't part of some of these conversations, it was really interesting to see that wealth of knowledge and concern about where we are today and where we need to go tomorrow. It was a pleasure to work with them, and Buck, it was great to serve under your chairmanship of this commission.
We were co-chairs. But thank you, George, and I
did all the good stuff.
I totally agree with everything that he said. And our differences that we had over the years were always on policy, never personal. I have great respect for George. He is a true liberal. He doesn't come to Washington and espouse something and go home and espouse something different. And that is something to be admired. I agree, George, that the task force was tremendous. And it was really interesting to see how we could have discussions, strong discussions, but we all were working for the same purpose, and that was to come together to better America. Many of these members of the task force are in the room here today. I would like to introduce them to you. I would like them to stand as their names are called. They're not all here, but the ones that are here, I would like to acknowledge them and ask them to stand. And please hold your applause till the end. We always say that. Sometimes it happens. We'll find out how educated this group is. Thank you. First, we have Michelle Asha Cooper. No,
Troublemaker.
Brian Fitzgerald. Martha Cantor. Cheryl Oldham. Lieutenant General William Lennox. Will Del Pilar. Diane Van Hook. She's in the emergency room out in Santa Clarita, California. Walter Kimbrough. Adam Looney. I hope it's nothing serious. That just, okay. But she has a real legitimate excuse. Jim Douglas. Tom Leppert. John Tierney. Also had some disagreements with him over the years, but we're both Irish, so that's okay. Gary Carruthers. Christine Gregoire. Now, I held this name last because I didn't want you to, we're actually going to acknowledge him for two things: being a member of the task force, but also being president of the LSU national champion football team that went 15-0, F. King Alexander. Again, thank you all for joining us today. I'm sure it will be a very good event, and you'll be enlightened and hopefully supportive of our efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to our co-chairs. I'm going to welcome up our first panel onto the stage now. That's going to be moderated by our senior analyst, Janan Batar.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Janan, and thank you for joining us today. Unfortunately, if you checked the schedule before, Zakiya Smith-Ellis and Mary Ellen McGuire were unable to join us. They both send their apologies. We'll miss them, but we have a great panel in store for you. So please join me in welcoming. We have Mark Jerome, President of Monroe College, James Quall, President, the Institute for College Access and Success, Claire McCann, Deputy Director for Federal Higher Education Policy with New America, and Nia Davis-Sagona, Government Relations Director, Higher Learning Advocates. We're going to dive right in. So the landscape of higher education is changing. And as our co-chairs mentioned, the last time the Higher Education Act was reauthorized was in 2008. My first question is for you, Nia. How do the needs of today's students compare to 10 or 20 years ago? And to what extent is federal policy addressing these needs?
Thanks so much for that question, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think to fully answer that question, I'm going to invite everyone in the audience to just take a second and think about where you were in 2008. What was happening in your life? I was still in college. Beyonce's Single Ladies had just hit the radio. World is really different. And today's students experience a very different educational life than the one that I experienced in 2008 in college. They are parents, they are working part-time, they are financially independent, which my mother asked me why that was a bad thing. And I told her, you are the reason why I was able to do this, right? A safety net. And federal policy that was written in 2008 that was designed to fit the needs of those students hasn't quite kept up with some of the demographic realities. And we can talk about the numbers and we can talk about how many new students are working while they're in school. But if you don't really think about what that means, where you are in life when that's happening, and what that means with the way that you interact with the education system, I think that we're doing a disservice to the opportunity to center our higher education system around students.
Thank you, Nia. So we also heard from our co-chairs about increasing prices. So James, my next question is directed towards you. Tuition fees, room and board at public four-year schools have increased by over 75% since the year 2000. What's driving these trends? And can you also tell us a little bit about the role state investment has played in these prices?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think it's important to remember that this is happening against a backdrop where family incomes are flat. People have seen very little wage growth over a couple of decades now. And so the cost of higher education, like the cost of healthcare and housing and so many other things that families need, is going up as relative to family incomes. College remains a pretty good bet for helping people go on to middle-class jobs. Even students from low-income backgrounds do quite well if they go to a good college. So I think part of the answer is incomes are flat while colleges and universities aren't very good at getting more productive. Part of the answer is that college is worth it, so families are willing to pay it. I also think it's important to remember that many of our colleges are underfunded, and if you look at community colleges, for example, we know we could have substantially higher graduation rates if we invested more in them. There's a wealth of evidence base. Now, the question of the cost is different a little bit from who pays, and we have seen over the last couple of decades steady decline in state funding per student at public colleges, where 3 and 4 students go. That's a long-term trend. It happens in every downturn. It was particularly pronounced in the Great Recession, where we saw state funding at public colleges go down by more than $2,000 per student. And as a result of that, tuition went up, student debt went up, and that's something that we still don't fully understand the ramifications of.
Thank you, James. So Mark, to follow up talking on prices, to what extent does the loan program and financial aid affect rising prices for students?
So first thing, it's important to note my perspective comes from working in the Bronx with low-income students for the past 25 years. I think I'm at the epicenter of many of these issues. Overall, I think the issue is more about generosity to institutions without appropriate accountability, and that's a great theme of your report. And I think the result of it is harm to students and to taxpayers. And if you look at tuition is actually too high in respect to the results that are put out. So just a few facts, which I talk about a lot. Number one, students who go to college should be expected to graduate. There are 816 degree granting schools with on-time graduation rates below 10%. Students who go to college should be expected to be able to pay back their loans. There are over 330 degree granting colleges with default rates over 20%. Students who go to college should be able to earn enough to pay back their debt. James and I met maybe 8 years ago over gainful employment, and I agree with that idea. But overall, as the data is coming out, it is clear that too many institutions give students too much debt and earnings aren't enough. And then lastly, and this is a little technical, people don't realize there's something called cost of attendance, and students are able, especially at low-cost institutions, to borrow money even if they have no actual expenses.
Thank you, Mark. So that gives us a little overview of rising prices and the system for students. Claire, I want to turn to you. There's been a lot of recent news and reports on parents borrowing for their children and the negative effects for low-income parents and financial security. Our task force put forth a recommendation to place underwriting standards on Parent Plus loans, but also allow low-income dependent students access to higher loan limits. Can you discuss the pros and cons of this approach and what policymakers should be considering when they're balancing issues of access and affordability?
Yeah, jump in with one of the easy recommendations. And if you haven't read my colleague Rachel Fishman's report, The Wealth Gap Plus Debt, I would definitely urge you to check that out. Most Parent Plus borrowers are upper income and they can afford the debt that they're taking on to help their children go to college. But for some low-income parents, that debt is becoming an untenable burden. And that problem is especially significant for Black parent borrowers. A third of white parent borrowers have incomes over $110,000, while a third of Black and African American Parent Plus borrowers have incomes lower than $30,000. And often those parents are taking on tens of thousands of dollars every year to send their kids to school. And while for students, loans can be an investment in their futures and a real tool for access, and it really solves the cash flow problem of not having the money to pay for school, but knowing that when you get that degree, it's going to pay off in the long run. Parents don't get to personally reap the benefits of their children's education. And moreover, Parent Plus loans aren't eligible for all the same safety net options that student loans are eligible for. So what's clear in all of this is that we really need to find targeted ways to make sure low-income students can go to college without taking on unaffordable amounts of debt. And we need lower prices for families, and we need more accountability to make sure that education is paying off. But on the off chance we can't get that done by tomorrow, I do think this is a good compromise of making sure we're retaining student loans as an access tool, and making sure that low-income students do have a way to pay for school and a way to get into college, while saying that parents who are never going to be able to repay those loans shouldn't be burdened with tens of thousands of dollars in additional debt. And so I think this is a strong consumer protection tool.
Thank you, Claire. Another way the task force chose to address pricing and investment was through a federal-state partnership. This would provide incentives to states to reinvest in their higher education systems. James, you and your organization have worked on this quite a bit. Can you describe for us what a federal-state partnership is, and why is it so important for policymakers to consider this as they discuss the reauthorization?
Well, in most areas of domestic policy, when federal and state share responsibility, they invest alongside each other. And higher education is a little bit unique in that efforts to invest more in Pell Grants and other types of federal support are not necessarily matched by increased state spending. And so the idea of a federal-state partnership is to supplement Pell Grants with some investment alongside states so that together we're making college more affordable and we're investing in higher success rates. So that is at the core, an idea that is similar to the free college proposals that presidential candidates are making. There are different types of proposals on the Hill. Some are focused more on educational expenditures rather than affordability. But the idea is we need to be investing together. I think one thing that is really positive about the proposal in this report is the idea that the federal government would help states through recessions. And really the problem with states, they do put more money in good times. The problem is they can't weather the bad times. They have balanced budget requirements. The federal government is the one that can put some extra resources on the table when we are in an economic crisis. And I think having that type of mechanism built into this program is really, really important. And then the last thing that I think is an important part of a Fed-state partnership proposal is having some kind of way of looking at the systemic problems in higher education. And we tend to think of colleges themselves as good or bad, as the units of change. But many of our problems have to do with students getting from high school not ready for college level work, students transferring from a community college without taking all their credits, systemically less funding going to colleges that serve the most low-income students and students of color. And so part of a federal-state partnership should be, in my opinion, asking states to think seriously about those problems as well.
Awesome. Thank you. The task force also adamantly wanted to tackle unmet need for students, seeing that as a challenge and barrier. And so we proposed significant increases in grant aid for low and middle income students. In fact, we recommend a $90 billion increase in mandatory Pell funding over the next 10 years. I'm actually going to pose this to the panel. Why is it important, and why are so many policymakers talking or prioritizing an increase in Pell funding? Does anyone want to talk a little bit about what Pell funding does for students?
I'm happy to start.
Start it off.
I mean, Pell funding allows students to attend, especially affordable institutions, without any debt. The thing I object to is Pell funding without any accountability. An institution should not collect hundreds of millions of dollars of Pell and have a graduation rate below 10%. So this is part of what's excellent about the report. I think we need a much bigger focus on accountability that accompanies the generosity of the money.
Excellent. Any other thoughts? That's great. Thank you so much, Mark. Finally, Claire, I'm going to talk about something. I've given you all the newsworthy bits. Another topic that has been highly publicized is the current public service loan forgiveness program. Can you describe for us public service loan forgiveness and some of the challenges it's faced in implementation?
Yeah, I'm sure we've all read all the articles about the 99% rejection rate for public service loan forgiveness applicants. I will say I am not as worried about the program, actually. That's because public service loan forgiveness is an extremely complex program, mostly on purpose. You have to be in the right kind of job, you have to have the right kind of loans, you have to be in the right repayment plans. For 120 payments, you can't have any slip-ups or you'll have to make more payments. You can't have a single deferment or forbearance along the way, or you'll have to make up those payments later. You have to be tracking all of these rules. But when public service loan forgiveness was created, most people had the wrong kind of loans, and most people weren't in the right repayment plans. And PSLF took effect in October 2007, which means the absolute earliest that this unicorn with a perfect repayment experience could get forgiveness would be October 2017, which is bad luck for Secretary DeVos. And the department didn't come up with a way to check and track your employment until 2012. So the years before that were a little bit of a black box for people in terms of whether or not they were doing the right thing. So I would say the 99% denial rate for public service loan forgiveness is not going to be 99% forever. Probably won't be 99% for very long even. But what has happened in the meantime is this huge amount of confusion, a lot of mistrust, and a crush of people who thought that they feel like they didn't get what they were promised on this.
And in our proposals, we would reform PLSF to an upfront benefit for students. Can you talk about how this might address some of the current issues facing the problem?
Yeah. So I think a significant problem here is that the vast majority of borrowers didn't know that they weren't following all of those rules until they got to the end. And it's so demoralizing to think you've reached the light at the end of the tunnel and then realize you have another mile to go or another 10 miles to go. And so I think one of the benefits of an upfront public service loan forgiveness benefit would be providing that real-time feedback to borrowers. You know, if you're getting if you realize this month that you're in the wrong repayment plan, you can fix it for next month, and you're not going to lose as much time. And so it also has the benefit, I would say, of providing a sort of equivalent benefit to everyone who's working in a public service job. So right now, you get the biggest benefit from public service loan forgiveness if you have a bigger amount of debt, because more of your debt gets chopped off at the end. This kind of equalizes that problem a little bit as well. So I think there are lots of discussions to be had about what the right dollar amount would be and whether you should get credit towards your loans for a job, whether you do it for 1 month or 5 years. But I think at a minimum, this would have probably helped solve a lot of the implementation challenges with PSLF.
Thank you, Claire. Nia, I want to come back to some of the proposals that the task force highlighted that better target federal spending to support students. Many of our recommendations include these, such as more seamless connection to applying for financial aid and food assistance, using campus-based aid for emergency childcare or micro grants. How do these types of supports impact student success?
Yeah, I mean, I think that coming back to the exercise of kind of putting yourself in the student's place, how many of you have children who had a delayed open in their school a couple of weeks ago when we had all that snow? What happens when you have to get to your finals? Right? Like allowing people to have access to things like emergency childcare, to things like microgrants that help them get over that last hump of financial hiccup that they might have if their car breaks down, for example, allows us to really drive this as a completion strategy and to consider, again, like what students are actually experiencing and meet them where they are.
Thank you, Nia. Mark, you have spent a lot of time working with students and with the loan program and the complexity. So our task force, a lot of the reforms want to reduce complexity and make it easier for borrowers to avoid under or over borrowing. So based on your experience, what do you think are the greatest challenges facing the federal loan program? Maybe what reforms would you recommend to improve efficiencies and put downward pressure on borrowing?
So I have 3 kind of radical proposals. So the first thing I never understood is why a student who attends a bachelor degree can borrow $57,000, but a same student who attends a 1-year certificate has the ability to borrow the same $57,000, even though the earnings are generally expected to go up by credential level. So I am proposing that Congress or the Department of Ed looks at refining annual loan limits to reflect credential levels and actually lower the amount of the maximum loan for associate and certificates, but allow for a waiver for programs that show good earnings now that the programmatic earnings are coming out. I think on a systematic basis, it would reduce overborrowing by a significant amount nationwide. So that's my first. The second is too many students borrow small amounts at affordable institutions but drop out in the first semester. Some of this reflects admissions policies that I would characterize as not appropriate. I've proposed that institutions be required, particularly for Pell recipients, to return the loan to the federal government for students who drop out in the first semester. It's like a skin in the game proposal, but I'm still bothered by the 500,000 annual defaulters. And I think if that was implemented, the number of students and the default rate would drop dramatically. My last comment is cost of attendance can absolutely be amended to reflect that students should borrow for expenses incurred If you Google the phrase, "Can I use my student loan to take a cruise?" you get 1.5 million responses. And this is generally a problem at lesser expensive places, but it's worth looking into.
Thank you so much, Mark. And you'll see if you take a look at our report, we do have several recommendations that talk about better assessing financial need and making sure that there isn't too much for students to pose a threat to repayment, but that they have enough need for success, persistence, and completion. I'd like to say thanks to all my panelists, but I'd like to give you all one more opportunity if you had any last comments on our recommendations are approving access and affordability in higher education. You go.
I'll jump in.
You'll jump in?
Sure. So, I mean, I think these recommendations altogether do a really great job of pulling in policy proposals that would greatly increase affordability and access to higher education while making sure there's still value in that higher education. One sort of note of caution that I might mention is that we've talked a lot today about the problem of basic needs and making sure that that federal financial aid dollars can continue to be used to make sure people can go to college and pay not just the tuition costs, because they do have other costs. And the risk of some of the rhetoric around overborrowing is pretty significant here in terms of how we perceive low-income students and how paternalistic we want to be about whether it's appropriate for them to spend dollars on food and rent and the many associated costs of higher education.
Thank you so much, Claire. Well, I really want to, James, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. I really want to commend the commission and its members for thinking about what's possible. And when I worked for Mr. Miller on the Hill and he tried to reach across the aisle, there was a sense of trying to find common ground, and I think too often right now we're easy to dismiss that. I think this report does have many recommendations in it that are realistic and that it could be a basis for common ground. I do think, perhaps predictably, that more resources do need to be a part of the conversation. We are using debt to finance low-quality educations that leave students worse off. And to the point Mark was making, debt plus poor student outcomes is really a toxic combination. And I think another piece that does need to be discussed is what we do about those colleges that really are so poor that they're leaving students worse off.
Well, thank you so much, James. That's a great segue to the next panel. But before we bring up the next all-star lineup, we are ready to take some questions from audience members. If you are raising your hand, someone with a mic will be coming to you.
Hi, thank you for your panel presentation. I'm just curious about your calculations on public service loan forgiveness. It looks like you could get a benefit of $18,000. Do you think that's enough to drive people to the areas of greatest occupational need in the country?
This is probably, does anyone want to? I'm also happy to.
Yeah, I don't know if there's enough research right now to know how effective any loan forgiveness benefit is in driving people to one place or another. I just don't think we have enough research on that. But I do think it's worth considering this idea of does a more immediate benefit have a little bit more impact in that respect than something that you have to wait a very long time for.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Other questions?
Hi, thank you for being here. So I hear a lot about how these programs are going to help, a lot of diverse communities and people low income. But the one thing I'm wondering is that there are a lot of students with disabilities, which, if you don't know, often takes about twice the time to graduate as the standard student. And I'm wondering how this program could help students like those.
I mean, I'll answer as someone who works so closely with the committee. I'm not sure we directly address needs of disabled students. But what I will say is that we do call for a lot more flexibility for institutions to use federal dollars in the way they see best fit to serve their students. So while we have proposals that specifically suggest things like micro grants or emergency childcare, what we're really hoping is that it's things like campus-based aid can be opened for the use by the institution as they see fit. So this could be something for schools who are serving our disabled student population well. They could retarget funds that they receive from the federal government to ensure that those students, if their time to degree is longer, that they have more resources and the support they need. So I think how we came to address that was to provide flexibility in the use of funds for several of our recommendations.
Can I make an address?
Yeah.
So the other thing is the state of New York actually publishes graduation rates by sector and institution for students with disabilities. I don't believe the federal government does it? So there is a second edge to this. There's the other problem of well-to-do students using disabilities as a sword in standardized exams to get a benefit for elite institutions, a la what we've been hearing in the news. So that's this other side of it. But we need the data first, and if we get the data, it's easier to make a decision on what to do.
Thank you, Mark. I think we have, they've got him.
Hi, Deborah Cromie with Education Finance Council. I really support the proposal around the PLUS loan program. I think that's been needed for quite some time. My question is to the panel or to you for the BPC report. What about all the families who are currently in the PLUS loan program who shouldn't have been in the PLUS loan program? And what can we do to help that population that's really failing, going into bankruptcy, just really struggling?
I'm happy to. Does anyone want to field it?
I'll mention quickly, when New America published a report on this issue, we did say as long as you have that long-term solution in place, short-term flexibility to allow those parents to access income-driven repayment options more easily, for instance, would be appropriate. I think one note of caution is that some have proposed the short-term fix without the long-term fix, which sets up an incentive structure that could be deeply problematic. And Kristen Blagg at the Urban Institute has worked on a paper on that issue. I can't recall the name of now. I don't know. But check it out. That's a good, yeah.
I mean, I'd also just like to note, of course, as comprehensive as our proposals were, there are definitely add-ons that can be made. We suggest to restrict the loan limits for the parents, but increase for dependent low-income students. If something of this nature were to be actually enacted, there's always the option to retroactively allow the current Parent Plus borrowers to either move those loans to their students or another option. It's not that we didn't get that far into the proposal, but that there's always options to retroactively give parents the opportunity for income-driven repayment, the similar income-driven repayment or loan forgiveness that students have access to. So there are options for retroactive for Parent Plus as well. We just didn't dig into that in our report. Does any other burning questions from the audience? Oh, we've got here.
Hey, this question is for everyone on the panel to jump in on. How does this address issues with students of color facing diversity issues in terms of teachers and counseling? I just want to know if it addresses that at all.
I would say that our report does not dive into Title II and teacher training and improvement. So I would say that this doesn't directly touch the lives of the training and teachers that come from diverse communities and then can serve those communities well. What I do think it does is help target resources so that institutions and states themselves can make the decisions on where they would like to put focus. And if that's their community, then it is within their rights and ability in our recommendations to repurpose some of these resources in the best way they see fit. So it doesn't directly address it, but I think there are ways that we provide additional resources And in the next panel, you're going to hear a lot about the additional resources that we've recommended, particularly for minority-serving institutions and institutions serving high number of Pell students.
One comment that my institution has about 70% of the faculty are of color, and we received a grant from the state of New York to train students to become teachers, but teacher ed programs are suffering across the country, and it's become almost impossible to attract Black and Latino students into teacher ed. And so whether it's through My Brother's Keeper or another initiative, the federal government could absolutely support state efforts to help attract diverse faculty to both high schools and colleges. And it's a big issue nationwide, it's a big issue in urban areas, and it's something students speak about themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think I saw one more hand.
Hi, I'm Dana Weskern from the National Governors Association. You guys have all kind of touched on ideas of what quality means. Should we be giving funding to programs that are of low or high quality? Given the complexities in sort of measuring quality, particularly at the state level, how do you recommend kind of focusing on that if you're looking at funding connected to quality?
Sure. Does anyone want to chat about some measures that quality might be?
Well, I think that when you're talking about quality, you have to distinguish between programs that have quality problems and then up the chain. So if you're talking about places where, like what Mark is talking about, where you're more likely to default than you are to graduate, that's clearly a quality problem. And we should talk about whether extending loans to students at that school is really doing them a favor. I think when you start talking about what it means to be a good or excellent school, it is more challenging because of the tremendous diversity of our higher education system. So, a learning assessment where students at a selective university outscore, as freshman incoming students outscore graduating students at a less selective university. What does that say about the relative quality of those universities? An institution that does very poorly on employment outcomes might be excellent at training students to go on to graduate school or training students to become priests or rabbis. And so I think it is difficult to say, here's a single metric that separates, the excellent from the average. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start by looking at the colleges that are really below a minimum floor and then talk about how we help colleges move along whatever dimension they're focused on.
And I agree with James's comment. The issue is, and politically we've been too nervous about the institutions, but there are, in my borough, the institution next to me has had on-time graduation rates between 1% and 7% for 10 years. And really, no one does anything about it. And there are things to be done. I think if we focused on-time graduation rates, even if a president just got a dear president letter from the secretary saying, your grad rates are too low, we'd like you to focus on it. But right now, graduation rates do not show up in any true accountability measure. So I would start there, and I would focus on low-income students first.
And if I can just add, I think to a large extent, we have outsourced this question of quality up the chain to accrediting agencies, and new regulations from the Education Department that take effect this year are going to drastically weaken the already extremely weak accreditation processes that we have, and the likelihood that accreditors are going to be able to take this seriously in any way under the new regulations is virtually none.
I think we have time for just one more question if someone has something.
Yeah, I just have to sort of follow up on Mark's comment. So I'm Martha Cantor, College Promise, and so one issue when I responding to the woman who asked about students with disabilities. So if my school next door has a high ratio of underprepared students that we took in, having run a community college for a long time, and has a very large percentage of students with disabilities, and has a very large percentage of minority students, first-generation students, has a large population of homeless veterans, and I'm going to have a low graduation rate. I'm going to have a grad rate of some 5 to 10, 15%. But I can document to the state or the government that these students are progressing. I can get my medical documentation that my students would be dead if it weren't for whatever we give them and the, all kinds of stuff. And they're learning to read, and they're getting better jobs, and they're doing X, Y, and Z. One of the frustrations is the federal system could not get that finite. So we have to aggregate up, and we think of people in terms of 1-year and 2-year certificates and degrees and 4-year and grad students, which is very simple, but we're leaving out the range of preparation that people are coming to the table with. So I'm just wondering, can you imagine any kind of solution for the federal government to play, and this, or a state like New York, whatever, to play a reasonable accountability role so those schools aren't screwed?
Yeah.
I'm not sure someone wants to.
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
If I had an answer for you, I'd probably be long gone.
I do think it's a great illustration of the tremendous diversity and the need to be careful. There is, to me, a difference in funding those programs with Pell Grants and funding those programs with student debt as well. And so I think we do need to be a little bit careful about when we talk about what are minimum standards. Maybe there is a distinction between what's appropriate to finance with loans and what other opportunities we want to make available to people.
And Martha, coming back to the beginning, the first comment, I think there are things that can be done to raise the completion rates of an institution you mentioned. My institution is in the Bronx, 75% Pell students, homelessness, non-high school graduates, about a 50% associate rate, and about a 70% bachelor rate. But we learned from the breakup of the New York high schools that students have to be treated differently now because they're coming from high schools where if they fail an exam, they're taking it again the next day. If they're absent, someone's calling them, and some of our public systems and private systems haven't caught up to the way we started. The students have changed. Higher ed hasn't changed enough.
We've got one last quick comment.
If I could just, the collective power of these recommendations is important. You can't just pour money into Pell Grants and without stopping the states from disinvesting. Because I'm going to have to increase tuition and fees $500, and we're putting $200 in a Pell Grant at a university. If the states don't abide by their responsibility and we allow the states to disinvest, tuition and fees are going up. And then we're going to be in the same argument we've been in about increasing Pell Grants by $200 or $250 each year. We've got to stop the states. There's accountability on the part, and worked with James and Martha on the college scorecard, on accountability on the part of the institutions. But there's also accountability on the part of state legislatures. And you cannot let the state legislatures continue to disinvest because tuition fees are going to go up, and whatever we put into Pell Grants gets watered down. You can't pour money into the front door without the back door being shut. And the back door is wide open right now because we're allowing state legislatures to back out of their responsibilities and completely federalize the American higher education system.
Thank you, FK.
Thank you, President Alexander. We're actually going to get into these issues of quality and accountability and capacity on the final session. But first, I want to thank Jeananne and all of our panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you.
And then I'm going to welcome up Bill Hoagland, our Senior Vice President here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, with our special guest for the next conversation.
Do what? Move that chair? Oh, okay. Good afternoon. I want to say at the outset here that it's with a little bit of trepidation that an old E5 is in a position of interviewing and discussing a two-star United States Air Force general here, but we'll do our best, General. We're moving from policy to operations now because General Brown here, who served, was a distinguished service for over 32 years in the United States Air Force. Just about a year ago now, Secretary DeVos appointed him as the Chief Operating Officer at the Federal Student Aid. So we're going to talk operations. We're not going to talk about policy per se here. And a lot of this came up in the previous panel. He came to the Department of Education from his final assignment as from the Air Force as the Deputy Commander for the Air Force Education and Training Command, where he was responsible for all of the Air Force education as well as basic and technical training. They're not giving us a lot of time, General, so we'll have to go quickly here. And I think I'd like to start with one of the questions that came up in the previous panel that you're directly involved in. I have a personal interest in this because I have a daughter-in-law who spent the last 8 years working in public service, opioids and some very difficult addictions, and she's is looking forward to the public service. Tell us about we've heard about the 99% rejection. How's the department handling this?
Yeah, let me start by saying thank you, Bill and Airman, for doing this, and thanks to the committee for a very thoughtful, I think, report that gets into a lot of the issues that we are dealing with every day. On the specific question of public service loan forgiveness, and with the context that we're the operators, if you will, in federal student aid, and so we are executing the legislation that's put before us, and where there is discretion for the Secretary, she is helping that with policy. But as the executors of that, and in also the context of the comment about the disapproval rate of 99%. So let's put that in context of what we've seen since we've been looking at this in detail. So I would caution the use of the word disapproved and say maybe it is ineligible at the time of application. Because what we found is really 80% of the folks that we are talking about in that group of 99% were applying before, in fact, they had reached those statutory requirements that we had been given. And I know that you all know them, but just to repeat, 10 consecutive years of service in a particular job, 120 payments, which are very specific. And not just, you need to be in the right job, right? And it needs to meet one of those that have been approved and have the right loan. Right? You have to make sure it is the right type of loan. The federal loan, some people have combinations of private and federal loans. What we've done is a couple of things. So the policy is what it is. So what we have done is made it so that when we go back out to a person that applies, we don't necessarily say that you were denied that time. We then go to the next part of the legislation, which is the temporary public service loan forgiveness, because we want to be sure that they understand a couple of things. One, are they in the correct job? Maybe they were and didn't report the certification. So that allows us the option to give them another shot to come back in, correct the record, say what job they're in, provide their employer's information, and then allow us to put them in the system with consideration for the payments that they made during that time, in case they didn't get it right the first time. If, in fact, that is true as well, and they're qualified, then we go back and begin to track them into the program and looking for that date when they have achieved 10 consecutive years and 120 payments. So much of this, I think, I would say, is our ability to personalize each borrower and each student with the data systems that we have so that we can go back out to them with useful information. We created and have gotten quite a use on what's called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Help Tool. And what this tool does, the first version of it, is it allows a borrower to go out and actually interact by saying, this is who I work for, and if that is who you work for, and you have the certification, to upload that certification and then get that to us online. Now, it seems like an administrative thing, but really the burden of this and the bureaucracy of it is very difficult for a customer. So that kind of tool that's being used has proven to be very helpful. One, to tell people if in fact they're in a qualifying program, and if so, how to get the form necessary to their employer to come back and give it to us. And we're even upgrading that tool in what we call Help Tool 2.0, which is going to allow them to actually sign online and do some of the other digitized things that are so important for our customers. So we need to be able to get them the right information. And it comes from us, by the way. It doesn't come from newspaper articles. No offense to all of our reporters out here. It comes from the Office of Federal Student Aid, and we need to be able to communicate directly with them.
Thank you, General. In the report that the task force is releasing today, they spent a lot of time focusing on the various shortcomings that students face when they're making their decisions about going to a college and the financing there. It's our understanding that FSA has been conducting some research on some of the pain points, the barriers also. Again, from an operational point of view, not from a policy point of view.
Sure.
What are you? How are you addressing these issues of the? Let's take an example that comes up. It's come up already this morning a lot of times, and that's things like the paucity of data available for a student who is looking at gauging an institution's performance and graduation rates.
So let me start with, you're correct, that is what we did. And now almost 2 years ago, we went out to our customers through focus groups, campus focus groups, surveying students, and we asked about our services, because at the end of the day, we're a customer service institution. And we gathered what we call pain points, and there was a long list of them. So there was some pain, I would say, in that we got back from that input. We learned things like, we don't know how to contact you, or we don't know how to make payments if we are trying to make payments. There are a number of 1-800 numbers. There are a number of websites, those kind of questions. And then I actually sat with some panels of students to ask about, well, how did you make your decision to go to school A, B, or C, and what kind of financial discussion did you have with your school or with whoever, your parent in your case. What we found is that our information was confusing. What we found is that, in fact, it is hard to get in contact with exactly who you made. Our ecosystem, as we call it, a series of loan servicers over the country, all with different ways of doing business. Those things are confusing to a student. We created and are now well into execution of what we call the next generation of federal student aid, which is essentially us, in my viewpoint, in my words, taking back our brand of this. And there are a number of tools associated with Next Gen Federal Student Aid. The first one was My Student Aid app. And some of you may be familiar with My Student Aid app. Now, remember, our customers are 21st century students now, right? They do everything with their cell phone. They want access 24/7. They're not necessarily interested in calling someone for customer engagement. They want it all in a digital format. So we have moved our systems from analog to digital, and we have many users who do their business on My Student app. And then we redid our website, for studentaid.gov, if you have been out there, and it has features on it like artificial intelligence. We have a bot that we call Addons, right? You can ask Addons questions, and this is the first year of Addons for a subset of students, but Addons knows the answers, and you can interact with Addons to get the answers to simplified questions. But we also created what is known probably best as the Informed Borrow tool. And we're about ready to roll that out. And what does that do, along with another tool called the Loan Simulator? Well, what it does is it allows a student to interact with, in a simulated environment, what a loan might mean. And then connect that to the college scorecard, which is being improved and has already got another improvement out, where that student can say, I can choose between several schools. here's the data on those schools, and here's the data on those schools as it relates to my major course of interest. And here's how much I might expect to make in year one. And as we continue to do this and mature that tool beyond year one, and if I can expect this kind of income, and if this school has these kind of persistent rates from freshman to senior, is that my best choice? Or is another school my best choice? And if I borrow X dollars and I want to major in this, what situation will it put me in my first year after graduation? We went as far as to have the acknowledgement saying that each year you're going to have to certify and acknowledge that you want to do that. Here's what we want out of that. So why all of that? We want to increase and make it easy to access our information. But even beyond that, we want a financially literate, informed customer and student. We will always have choices, but we're not trying. You know, we have a 1.5 trillion student loan portfolio of grants and loans. It's not our goal for that to go higher, right? That's not our goal. Our goal is to have a good outcome. So we want the student on the beginning to be able to make the best fiscally responsible decision before they go into the process.
Thank you, General. They're clearly want you to get back to work because they're giving us the hook here already. But
okay.
Let me try one last question, General. Congress recently passed the Futures Act.
Right.
I love the acronym. Fostering undergraduate talent by unlocking resources for education. Future Act. Critical because it did provide, as I understand, permanent mandatory funding for the HBCUs and the minority-serving institutions. It also, as I understand, reduced in this document nearly 22 questions, as I understand. Now, operationally, you're in the operations, Chief Operating Officer. It also talks about data sharing between the Department of Education and IRS on going forward. Can you tell us about, since I guess that's just signed into law by the President back in December,
right.
What's the implementation of the Futures Act?
Absolutely, and just to baseline everybody, and thank you for that question, and thanks to the committee that looked at the importance of data sharing within government. And just to baseline everyone, if you have done this or have had a relative that was filling out their federal student aid form, the form that you picked up there, and you got to the point where you needed your IRS data, even in our 21st century technology, you had to get out of our system and you had to get into the IRS system. It's called a DRT, or data retrieval tool. You had to give them permission to give you their data so then you could give it to us. And needless to say, that is not a seamless process, and those pain points I talked about, we got lots of feedback on the frustration of that system. So very happy for the Futures Act. What it does is allow us to automatically have access to that customer's IRS data, which is going to go on the form anyway. And if you think about it, you filled out some forms where after you've done the first couple of lines, it auto-populates, and then you no longer have to do those other lines because it does it for you through the system. Think of it in a simplified version that way. And while that might seem like a small thing, but if you can take several layers of questions off of that form, the frustration and the pain points go down for our customers. So that's essentially what that's done. We're very happy with 6103. We are meeting almost daily now, and I have met now 2 times with the IRS on our execution of implementing this. It is complex because, as you can imagine, 2 large data systems. We hope to pilot something this year and be into it by one plus big FAFSA cycles. So we think our customers are going to be very excited about that. And I also want to say there's one other part to it. We go out and we ask schools to validate things, and we ask students to validate things related to their income. It's necessary. It's good stewardship. We should do it, right? We should ensure that the things on there are accurate. But it's a very big administrative burden for the school and sometimes for the student in providing information back. What this allows us to do is to go get what they've already given the government, big picture government. If they've already given the government income data, then we can validate many of those things without ever going back out to the student or the administrative burden on the financial aid administrator. So we have high hopes for this. Plan to see something in a pilot format this year, as we go to the next year, plan to see even more. And if we can do it faster than that, we will. And as I said, we're meeting every day to implement what the legislation gives us.
Well, thank you, General. You've done an awful lot in even the 1 year that you've been in that position. I want to thank you for your service to the country, for the years that you served in the Air Force. It shouldn't, as I say, policies can be very challenging, and we've had it here in reaching agreements and the recommendations in this report. But operationally, you hold the keys right now to moving forward until we have changes in policy at the legislative level. So we wish you the best and hope you can move. I'm sorry we don't have more time. You've got to get back to operating this program. At this time, I'd like let's give him a thank you, please. Thank you all. Thank you all. At this time, I'd like to invite to the stage the next panel and introduce Kenny Megan, who, as you already know, is Assistant Director of Higher Education and here at BPC, and who, along with his staff, have spent, as Shai said, many hours, sweat and tears, working with the task force and the chairman and bringing about this report. So thank you again, General.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. See you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you to our panelists. Joining me today, we have Bethany Little, Principal at Education Council, Kayla Elliott, Senior Policy Analyst at the Education Trust, Jason Delisle, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Robert Kelchin, Associate Professor of Higher Education at Seton Hall University and BBC Fellow. So we don't have much time today, so I want to dig right into questions. So the federal government allocates around $150 billion each year in student loans and Pell Grants. Jason, you've done significant work looking at the risks facing students and taxpayers from the current system. Can you describe these risks and kind of give us a lay of the land here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the risks in the student loan program are actually not often what people think they are. People tend to think that students defaulting poses huge risks to the government and taxpayers. It's actually not the case because the defaults are fairly small loan balances, and the government tends to get almost all that money back. The big risk to taxpayers in the loan program actually is the income-based repayment program. This program in 2009, when it got going, and it was enacted with bipartisan support, costs under $1 billion a year. After some reforms were enacted not with bipartisan support, the costs have risen to $15 billion a year. Most of that money is going to people who went to graduate school, not struggling undergraduates.
What about the risk facing students? Anyone want to comment on student risk in the current system?
I will. Sure. I think that that's exactly the right point to make, which is that we've chosen a financing system of higher education in this country that means that it is not risk-free for students. It's all largely based on the loans. And I think many years ago, we've had this federal really agenda of access as the really only focus of federal policy, and that's no longer sufficient. And many years ago, the federal government essentially abdicated the question of quality assurance and access to that large amount of money, both federal money and student money, to accreditors, and they are clearly not up to the task any longer. And I think it is time for us to take a really hard look at how it's possible that I think the Waze app used more data to get me here this morning than the federal government used to determine $150 billion worth of loan giving out last year, and that's not functional.
Yeah. So how does the federal government seek to mitigate risk? What are the federal programs here, and how effective are they? Robert, you wrote a book on this last year. You want to comment on the federal landscape and the extent to which these programs are effective?
Yeah, the federal government has a number of different tools to try to generally keep out the lowest performing institutions. The one that historically had the most teeth is cohort default rates. If too many students defaulted on loans, colleges could lose federal loan eligibility. And in the 1990s that happened. Nowadays it doesn't really happen, in part because we have income-driven repayment. And colleges can help students get into income-driven repayment or into forbearance or deferment, and all of a sudden colleges don't worry as much about this measure now. There are some other measures. There's the 90-10 rule, there's heightened cash monitoring, there are other things that try to get the bottom end of colleges, but by and large, they don't really affect that many institutions. And it's difficult to have conversations about raising that quality bar because more colleges get affected, and colleges tend to be pretty good lobbyists.
So I want to dig into this a little bit more. So last year, so first off, we have 5,000 institutions eligible for federal aid. Last year, just 15 were sanctioned for breaching the cohort default rate. 10 of them were cosmetology schools. So what is it about the CDR that's ineffective? What are the levers here that aren't working? Or are the 4,900 something institutions all doing very well? Anyone?
Yeah, I'll start with that then. So one of the challenges here is it's a 3-year cohort default rate, and if you're pushing students into income-driven repayment, it's a risk for the taxpayer, not for the institution, and it can still be a good thing for the student. Deferment forbearance, it mitigates the risk for the college, but it still puts risk back on the students. And colleges don't want to lose federal aid eligibility, so they'll put money into default management. And colleges that have at least some money can afford to hire these services, and that's why we see only the really small mom and pop for-profit colleges generally being affected by cohort default rates.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I'm not sure that a cohort default rate measures what Congress wanted it to measure. I think when it was created in the 90s, lawmakers were looking for a proxy that measured, can you pay back your loans? And if you can't, well, there must be something wrong with the school, right? And the earnings that you're getting from the education are not enough to pay the loan. But we actually, that isn't necessarily what we see with defaults. I'm not sure that the people who are defaulting because they have huge unmanageable debts. They're $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. In fact, a study we did a few years ago, we found that within about 5 years after defaulting, 30% of the people who had defaulted had completely paid off their loans within 5 years. Which suggests to me then, well, wait a minute, if those loans were still unaffordable, how did they fully pay them off in 5 years? So it just suggests to me that this isn't really measuring what we want to. It's a proxy. And we actually, now that we have better data on earnings and prices and loan repayment and all of these things that really weren't available in 1990, we could measure those things instead. And that's some of the things that you're recommending in the report.
So that's a great segue. One of our recommendations, or the task force recommendations, is to enhance the CDR and use other outcome measures to tie to institutional accountability. Now, question for the group, what other measures should policymakers be considering if they want to strengthen accountability and weed out the worst performing and predatory institutions from being able to access federal aid?
So I think the panel earlier did a good job of pointing out that we have to start with the question of outcomes and are students actually completing a degree. And institutions do have significant responsibility and ability to impact whether or not students graduate. We heard earlier from somebody asking about whether or not your recommendations get to the experience students have on campus. Who is teaching them? Are there supports? And actually you do through your accountability questions, because their students are more likely to complete if they have an experience that affirms their identity, that sends a signal of belonging, that supports their academic and other needs. So completion has to be a part of the metric. Repayment's going to continue to matter. There's a value question. The question is not just the cost of the education. The question is the cost of the education versus what it is yielding for me, for my investment. And so that has to continue to be on the table too. But the other metric that I think you rightly put on the table is the question of what institutions are spending their dollars on. So if an institution is extremely low quality in some ways that are showing up in outcomes being low, both in repayment and in graduation, that's problematic. But the question of what you do do about it as a result is more nuanced. If an institution cannot do better because it is under capacity, that's a different question than an institution that will not do better, that is choosing to spend its dollars on recruiting or marketing rather than on student supports and academic excellence.
That's actually a great segue into kind of two-pronged question here. Number one, now this issue of institutional finance measures, which you touched on, is somewhat controversial. That part of that is due to the IPEDS Finance Survey, which measures instructional spending, student supports, student services, and there's some criticism that, they're not really measuring what we would need them to in order to operationalize a system that tied accountability in part to what institutions are spending their money on. Can anyone kind of expand on this or tell us what the problems are with the IPEDS Finance Survey and why it's difficult to measure what institutions are actually spending their dollars on?
Well, I'm kind of a problem in that extent. I'm a professor, I'm the oddball professor here, and my time is spent doing teaching, research, and service. And I have a strong expectation that most faculty are counted under the instruction bucket, even when you're doing a whole bunch of other things. So it's hard to have a really narrow thing saying you're just looking at instructional spending, even if some of the, say, marketing, retention, there are other things that we probably can separate out. So I would encourage a broader definition than a really narrow one that can be easily gained.
Yeah, and that's why one of our recommendations in the report is to kind of differentiate what institutions are spending on for student success versus activities designed to attract more revenues like marketing, recruitment, lobbying, intercollegiate athletics. But this would require reforms to the IPEDS Finance Survey and action among policymakers. The other thing I wanted to touch on is institutional capacity. And so a big issue we touched on with the task force is how do you differentiate between the bad actors and the institutions that have bad outcomes because they lack the resources to meet the metrics. So Kayla, you've done a lot of work on the kind of nexus of capacity building and equity and accountability. Can you kind of give us your thoughts on these issues?
Sure. So I have to thank the first panel for starting out that conversation for sure, and really honing in on the difference and importance of institutional context and the students that you are serving. So I do a lot of work around Title III, Title V, and minority serving institutions, and I think the conversation on capacity building has to start there for sure. These institutions, when you look at historically black colleges and tribal colleges, have a mission to support underserved communities and communities that have been disenfranchised historically. The institutions themselves, we found over the years, have also been marginalized and disenfranchised in terms of underfunding from both public and private sources. So when you think about holding institutions accountable, accountability policies cannot be one size fits all. And as much as an accountability policy can hold up an institution that is not doing its part to serve low-income students and under-resourced students, it can definitely keep down institutions that are. So the UNCF actually has a great institute for capacity building where they focus on technical support, institutional advancement, and data support and capacity building around the ability to not only establish student success practices, but to measure and communicate that with public and private funders also. So I think that's a great example to learn from. We also see some examples, speaking of faculty, Miami-Dade College has a data academy for their faculty to talk about what it means to translate data from the classroom to the program level, to the institutional level, and how that works with both state and federal accountability measures.
Great. So just digging a little bit more into Titles III and V, so two-pronged question. Number one, just can you give some background on these titles just for folks that might not be, might not know too much of the details? And then number two, one of our recommendations in the report is to convene an independent study to look at the allocation formulas for these titles. One issue here is the fact that a lot of these titles, especially through 3A and 5, are competitive grant funding. and there's some controversy over whether that's the best way to deliver these resources. Can you first kind of tell us about Titles 3A, 3B, and 5, and then talk a little bit about the allocations?
Sure. So Title III originally was for community colleges, small colleges, and historically black colleges and universities. Historically black colleges and universities remain in 3B, but 3A now encompasses tribal colleges, what we know as predominantly black institutions, ANAPESES, which are Asian American, non-Native American serving institutions, and Hawaiian serving institutions. So a number of designations that have been given for institutions that have a core amount of students, whether that's 10%, 25% of students who are students of color, and that's in 3A. In 5, we see our Hispanic serving institutions. I think the challenge there is that these are really diverse institutions. We're talking community colleges. There are some R1s that have the same designation in Hispanic serving institutions. And when you make those grants competitive, they obviously have different capacity to compete, to do grant writing, to designate the programs, the time, and the resources necessary to be competitive.
And so does anyone have any ideas on what a potentially better way or preferred way to deliver these resources would be?
I think going back to your suggestion around a study, I think that any conversation on these institutions, just giving that one example of saying, like, you've got an R1 and a community college that are both Hispanic serving institutions, you're asking them to compete for some of the same dollars, that context is necessary. All too often what we've seen with state level accountability mechanisms, specifically outcomes-based funding, is that institutions that don't have the capacity, institutions that are under-resourced, are also locked out of the design process and out of the assessment process. So I think even though it will be an independent study, it absolutely has to be contextualized by the diversity of these institutions, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Great points. I want to switch gears a little bit because we got 7 minutes left. So another issue the task force tackled was, how do you promote continuous improvement among every institution in the higher education system, not just eliminating the bad actors, but creating incentives so that schools focus on outcomes and the system improves. The way the task force seek to achieve this was by proposing a risk-sharing system that would require every institution to pay a small premium tied to the relative negative exposure that it poses to the federal loan system. So Robert, how would this risk-sharing system work, and can you just describe its rationale?
Sure. The rationale is that colleges don't bear any of the risk for the student loans. As we talked about, the cohort default rate doesn't mean that much. And it's very similar to the state performance outcome-based funding ideas, where you put essentially a small amount of your funding at stake in a given year, and you earn it back based on having reasonably good student outcomes. And since it's the Bipartisan Policy Center, it's also one of those things that can help get support from the right side of the aisle for continued federal spending on student loans.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I struggle with the idea of risk sharing because of the lessons that we've learned from state outcomes and performance-based funding, where we've seen that under-resourced institutions continue to suffer. So as a part of my research on these policies, I actually had a chance to talk with a lot of students about their perception of accountability policies. And when you have students articulating and linking their own financial struggles and ability to get institutional support, whether that's through dollars or support services, with what they know and see and hear in the conversation around their institution losing funding, I don't think that we're sending the right message to students or to the institutions that are serving them. I also think when you're talking about risk sharing specifically, as well as any other penalties or putting money on the line or putting skin in the game, sequence matters. We have a number of accountability principles that we've suggested from Ed Trust, but one of the things that we stress is the importance of sequence and order. Any conversation around penalty has to happen after capacity building. It has to happen after we've addressed some of the institutional differences and the diversity there. It has to happen after we've given sufficient time for institutions to meet and exceed the new accountability measures.
I'm going to let Jason respond in just a moment. But Kayla hit the nail on the head of what was one of the major, I'd say, pressure points on the task force, was how do you balance accountability and capacity building? And I think what the group came down on is that they're really two sides of the same coin, and that we do need capacity building first. So the report recommends the investments to Titles 3 and 5 would start immediately, and then the risk-sharing system would be phased in after several years to give institutions adequate time to assess their processes. The other point I wanted to make was that there's also some adjustments that would be made to the system. So schools, for example, that spend a lot of money on their students versus spending on marketing and recruitment would see a discount on their premium, as well as schools that enroll a high proportion of low-income students. But now, Jason, you had a comment you wanted to make.
No, well, I mean, I think one of the frustrations I have with the conversations around risk sharing and accountability in the higher ed policies, which, you know, I think is, I also felt reading the commission's report, to be truly honest, is that so much of the accountability work is being linked to loans, right? That there isn't, and the giant Pell Grant program, really, no one is concerned about accountability around that, even though that's the much more expensive program, right? That's where most of the money is, and so I would just encourage people to think more about, you know, at least question, well, why are we only doing accountability with loans and not with grants? At least ask the question, since I think a lot of people don't get there. The other frustration I have with it, and you can see this in the report, is we've got a big, bold statement about needing risk sharing and accountability, and then suddenly we start creating lower outcome standards for minority serving institutions, for institutions that enroll lots of low-income students, right? And so this concerns me, because what we are saying is we have lower standards for you as an institution if you enroll low-income students. We will tolerate worse outcomes for students at your institution if you enroll many poor students or minority students, which frankly, I'm a little disappointed that there's bipartisan support for lower standards for poor students.
Well, just to push back on that, I think the intention from that policy was to incentivize increased enrollment of low-income students, because I guess the fear on the other side of the aisle is that, you know, if you put a blanket accountability system on, then schools will have the incentive just to enroll students who are well prepared, increase their admissions criteria, and then that will have negative equity effects. And then on your point for Pell, accountability for Pell, we actually do have a Pell accountability proposal that would reward institutions that effectively serve high proportions of Pell students. So.
I don't think that giving different expectations for different institutions based on the students they serve is lowering expectations at all. I think that it is taking into account that students come to institutions at different levels of preparedness. I think it is taking into account that a one-size-fits-all and one metric does not apply to every type of institution. I think it is growth over mastery, right? So if we're asking for incremental growth and incremental benchmarks, I don't see a problem with that.
Just want to open it up, just switching gears a little bit. I just want to know feel out the panelists on what their thoughts are on the probability that a comprehensive HEA package will be reauthorized in this Congress.
My favorite question.
We'll start with that.
Sure. Look, I think I would say you all have done your part this morning to try to make that more likely. I mean, the truth is that all four of the big four, the chairman and ranking on the Senate and House, have expressed theoretical support for these sorts of changes. But going from theory to real proposals is hard work. And I've seen Chairman Miller, Chairman McKeon do this over the years. And they really, I think, wrestled with you all and the rest of the committee to get some concrete things down on paper that can help advance that. The deal is fairly clear. There's some set of trade-offs that are on the table, and the big move is directional. It's always important to remember Federal policy is a blunt instrument. It's going to be about patterns. It's going to be about, really, are we getting at lowest performance, not are we moving people from 75% graduation to 76% graduation. And so you have to really recognize when the federal government puts its thumb on the scale, it's going to be directional. And if they send a strong signal in this reauthorization that outcomes and data for success of students matter as much as access, then the ways in which they do that, there are myriad options. And you've put some good ones on the table. And I think they want to do that, and I think they can do that. And I think many of them are motivated to do that. So I'm on the hopeful side, although not naive about the barriers in their way, not the least of which is impeachment.
Anybody else want to weigh in before we open it up for questions?
I think it's theoretically possible, but just been hearing a lot about focus on prescription drug prices. And that would go through the Senate Help Committee. And we just don't know how many legislative days there really will be. So even if there's an idea that this wants to get done, just do we have enough time on the clock left to do it?
I would just add, there's a lot of focus, right, on a big reauthorization as the way things get done for higher education policy. But for the past 10 years, since the reauthorization, there have been many, many, many changes to federal programs and policies around higher education. It doesn't need to happen through a reauthorization. It might be better if it did, rather than last minute, dark of night, in a giant omnibus bill, that kind of approach. But things still get done or rammed through on a filibuster-proof reconciliation bill. But, things can still get done, and I would encourage people to, think about attaching proposals and getting them done that way.
Okay. With that, let's open it up for questions. Oh.
I just want to point out, back in 06, 07, and 08, and you got to call him out. I know Ted left, Ted Mitchell, because he's going to change ACE. It was NICU, it was the for-profits, and it was ACE that were against the college scorecard, that were against outcomes-based data, that were against these accountability measures, that were against reporting student loan indebtedness on every campus. And so you had three of the big six already lobbying on the Hill, as Congressman Miller knows and McKeon knows. Certainly, the higher ed wasn't unified in this accountability effort. And you had basically the for-profits and the privates saying no privacy, screaming privacy every time. And they screamed privacy in 1991 with iPads, and they're saying the same thing about outcomes-based information that consumers need to know and parents need to know, and my students and my parents need to know what's going to happen when they graduate.
Okay. I would just say really quickly on the privacy thing, I've often pressed congressional staff who've responded privacy as a reason for not doing this, and I asked them, well, what do you mean by that? And their answer often is, well, I'm concerned what the government might do with the data. I'm like, well, that's not privacy. That's a concern about big government, which is fine. That's legitimate. But just say that's what it is and not privacy, because that's what we spend all of our time on.
And I would just also add, I don't think that much has changed in terms of who's opposing what these days. The House put through a great bill in the committee that does a lot of really good things around data and outcomes. And among them are, how about accreditors actually look at data and do some things that are related to outcomes? And ACE and all of its cohort came out against it because, God forbid, we should use data in making these sets of decisions, or against at least those provisions, not against the whole bill. So that is an important problem that you raise.
So you mean it's really hard to close a college?
Better hope it is.
First question.
Hi, Frank Bowen with NASGAP. So my question is, I think states are generally happy with your performance funding programs, but they realize very quickly you have to update them and tweak them every year. For example, graduation rates at community colleges aren't necessarily indicative of things like people transferred to a four-year, et cetera. So my question is, given that HEA is reauthorized every 5, 10, whatever years, what mechanisms should you put in place to make sure that any accountability measures don't have unintended consequences that create a disaster?
This one for me, I guess. So if I'm understanding your question, I think part of that has to do with data. So another one of our recommendations is to have student level data, which I think would no longer be backwards looking, and you could get more granular on what the outcomes actually are and identify, hopefully in better real time, especially with our school closure recommendations. Right now, the system that guides whether or not a school is going to close uses data that can be 3 or 4 years old. So getting better real time, so that leads to colleges closing, and then regulators don't know what to do, and then it's an emergency situation. So just getting better real-time data into the system is crucial for any kind of an accountability mechanism, but I'd say most importantly for a school closure process.
Can I also add, I don't know what you would term a disaster, but for a lot of students today, the current system's a disaster. There are many students with debt and no diploma. There are many students for whom their debt has not bought them enough to pay off their diploma. There are many students, hundreds of thousands of them, whose institutions have closed while fully accredited, and they can't get their debt forgiven. And so actually Congress is pretty good at responding to disaster, maybe not at responding to nuance. And so I think if it were really a disaster, you can change the law. But the current system as it is isn't working for a lot of students.
Other questions?
I have one about
Mike's coming.
work and education. So we have Department of Education, we have Department of Labor. In the Obama administration, we worked to try to integrate ourselves to some shared goals. And we talk about the HEA as if it's its own silo. And we talk about WIOA as its own silo. And I would just like you, if you could paint a future, maybe not in this reauthorization, because I think I teach it, and I think it's our 11th one. Is it our 11th or 12th reauthorization since we started reauthorizations in the 60s? And this was the longest one in between 2008 and today. But I'm just wondering if you could paint a picture, because students are working while they go to school. And the fact is, I was on a workforce board for 10 years, and it was its own silo. It was its own nonprofit. It was its own competitive entity with a lot of other entities in the region that I worked in. And so I'm just trying to think about, is there any opportunity in the future to kind of think through the student experience and then go backwards and say, okay, we've got these two incredibly important agencies, and we have Bureau of Labor Statistics, which God knows, to try to account for anything in the data systems that Michelle and I talk about is a nightmare, is its own little problem, which you all know. So I'm just wondering, any thoughts about work and education and the way maybe some additional thought to the policy report today could be, thought through in the next 6 months, a year, if we have that time.
Anyone want to comment on the nexus of workforce and education?
So I think you hit on an amazing point around data and data sharing and what we know in different places but don't talk to each other. So we don't talk to each other, but then our systems and data don't talk to each other either. Employment is a very important outcome, and we don't know enough about it. That's one thing that's falling to accreditors, but even accreditors measure that in very different ways. So even if we wanted to look at it nationally, we wouldn't be seeing the same number. So I think it's a number of different agencies, accreditors, and institutional partners like ourselves to get on the same page and have some sort of understanding around what an accountability metric or multiple metrics could look like.
We have a question right here.
Thank you for your presentations. I have a question. There are two things that I'm thinking about a lot these days, and one is the concept of value and ensuring that students have value to their degree and their credential that will not only help them get a good job and make decent earnings, that will actually put them on a path that is promoting economic opportunity and mobility for the long haul for them, their families, and their communities. I'm also thinking about equity and making sure that that value is afforded to those students that we spoke about or heard about in the first panel, those students that really do make up the new majority, the growing majority of our college students today. When you look at the recommendations that we put together for the report, is there anything you think we missed? that we should be thinking about when you put that concept of value and equity together and you think about the future of that next generation? Is there anything that we should be thinking about that we haven't mentioned, or have we just really been really trying to improve all of those current things that we know are already problematic with our system?
Anyone?
I think what happens in the years that you are on a college campus or enrolled in an institution is incredibly important to what you're able to do afterwards. When I think about value, when I think about like the impact of my college education or those around me, the education that they had and what they were able to do after, I think about learning and I think about climate. And I don't think we've figured out how to measure those two things for sure. Learning is incredibly difficult and is something that we're still grappling with. But climate seems to be a little more accessible in terms of being able to measure. And there are a number of organizations and institutions and centers that are doing work around campus climate, but that's not really being talked about at a federal level or at the state level in terms of accountability. So thinking about the diversity of your faculty and staff, thinking about and measuring racial campus incidents in the same way that we do sexual assaults with the Clery Act. I think we have examples of how this can be done to not only just measure campus climate and what's going on, but to offer some accountability for that as well.
I'd just add, I know, Michelle, you were part of an excellent panel of folks who also put together a report with Lumina on quality and equity and the deep tie between those. And I think that's absolutely the way that Congress needs to think about this as it approaches all of the reauthorization. And one place in which we do this in K-12 now, but we haven't gotten there in higher ed, is the issue of data disaggregation. We don't actually even look at the nuances of data. We don't even collect the full set of data on students that we would need to look at the nuances of data and understand how are veterans impacted and how are students of color impacted and how are low-income students impacted and what are the intersections of those. So disaggregation of data is one component, but I do agree with Kayla that it really matters the experience that students have on campus, and to be honest, the federal government hasn't sent that message as a priority. It has sent a priority message of enroll, 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 we will send the check. And so if there is even a bit of a thumb on the side of completion and success of your students is something we are keeping an eye on, I think you'll see a lot more institutions actually stopping and making different decisions about how they understand and address the needs of their students instead of just saying, okay, well, we can always enroll another one.
Kenny, we've been talking a lot about student debt, and as you know, my bent is on public debt also, which is a tax on the future generation. I think it's wise before we break here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Kenny, for you to outline why we think this is deficit neutral. what those provisions were that we had in there.
So we identified, or the task force identified, a lot of pay-fors for some new spending expansions. So the big expansions that are recommended are the, and these are 10-year costs I'm outlining, $50 billion for the federal-state partnership, $90 billion for Pell expansion, and then $4 billion for investments in Titles 3 and 5. The big pay-fors are eliminating tax expenditures, which would be tough because it's a different committee jurisdiction, but it is really one of the largest expenditures on higher education. I think something like $200 billion over 10 years. Eliminating subsidized loans, which was a very controversial part of the task force deliberations because these are benefits that accrue mostly to the middle class. And then the risk-sharing proposal raises roughly $4 billion over 10 years by our estimates. And then the big question marks here are the turning public service loan forgiveness into a flat monthly benefit. It's unclear how much this would cost. And then also underwriting Parent Plus loans, because under the current budget scoring rules, the government gets savings from these loans. But I think policymakers could craft these interventions to make them budget neutral. I mean, it might require some kind of means testing on the PSLF reforms. Any other questions? All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. Once again, thank you for the task force for their work over the last 18 months, and thank you to our panelists today. And I urge you all to grab a copy of the report and our summary of recommendations in case you don't want to read 140 pages and executive summary. Thank you again.
Great job, man.